HOA Karen blocks a fire truck, then her house catches fire. Living in an HOA-controlled neighborhood is already frustrating, but having Karen as our HOA president made it unbearable. She was the kind of person who enforced ridiculous rules just to exert power. Fines for grass being too long, complaints about holiday decorations, even threats over the color of someone's mailbox. But nothing compared to the day she blocked a fire truck, only to watch her own house go up in flames. It all started on a scorching summer afternoon. I was at home when I heard sirens in the distance. A fire had broken out at Mr. Thompson's house. An elderly man who lived 2 streets over. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky as the fire truck approached our gated community. But when it reached the entrance, it came to an abrupt stop. Karen had parked her car directly in front of the gate. Firefighters honked, sirens blaring, but Karen strolled out of her house, arms crossed, shaking her head.
You can't come in. HOA policy states that emergency vehicles need prior authorization to enter.
The fire captain stepped out, incredulous. Ma'am, we don't need permission to respond to an emergency. Karen scoffed.
This is private property. No authorization, no entry.
By now, several neighbors had gathered, watching in disbelief. One woman shouted,
Karen, get out of the way. There's a fire.
But Karen wasn't budging. She pulled out a clipboard, flipping through pages.
Unless you fill out the proper forms, I can't allow.
One of the firefighters turned to a police officer who had just arrived. She's obstructing emergency services. We need her car moved now. The officer wasted no time. Ma'am, step aside or we'll tow your vehicle. Karen gasped in outrage.
You wouldn't dare!
Try us, the officer said, radioing for a tow truck. At that moment, a loud explosion rocked the air. The fire had spread to a gas line in Mr. Thompson's home. Flames shot higher, and the firefighters, unable to wait any longer, forced their way through the gate on foot, hauling equipment down the street. Every wasted second mattered, and Karen had just cost them precious time. But karma wasn't done with her yet. As firefighters worked tirelessly to contain the blaze, a gust of wind sent embers flying. A few landed on the dry leaves in Karen's front yard. At first, it was just a few smoldering patches, but within minutes, small flames flickered to life. A neighbor screamed, "Karen, your house!" Karen spun around, her face going pale as she saw the flames creeping up her perfectly manicured lawn, grabbing her garden hose and spraying wildly. But it was too late. The fire spread faster than she could control. Desperate, she turned to the firefighters, whom she had just delayed, and screamed,
Help me, put it out!
The fire captain gave her a hard look. We'll get to it when we can. You made us lose time. Karen stood frozen, watching as the flames climbed her porch. The firefighters continued battling the main fire while Karen's house burned. By the time they were able to respond, her pristine white siding had melted, her roof had partially caved in, and her beloved flower beds were nothing but ash. By evening, the fires were finally under control. Mr. Thompson's house suffered major damage, but thanks to the firefighters' efforts, the surrounding homes were spared, except for Karen's. As she stood in front of the charred remains of her home, her once unshakable confidence shattered. The police officer approached. Ma'am, you're being cited for obstruction of emergency services. Expect legal action. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but for once, she had nothing to say. The next day, the HOA board held an emergency meeting. Facing overwhelming pressure from furious residents, Karen was removed as president. The community celebrated her downfall, and for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a better place. And as for Karen, she moved out soon after, leaving behind nothing but the burnt remains of her former reign of terror.